Okay, hi everybody. So, what we're going to do in this tutorial is learn how to make the physics animation. So I'll just play my Blender to remind you the animation that I've made in my sample scene. You'll see that the metal ball here is going to roll forwards, it'll fall off the book, and it'll knock over the little gold bars, and then it falls off the table. And the gold bars fall over and kind of clump there on the table. Okay, so if we go back, we can sort of see that this requires a few different obvious things, and there's one or two hidden things. So first of all, we need to tell Blender that some of these things are solid objects. So that'll be the book that the ball is sitting on, the table that the ball lands on, and then the ball and these gold bars we need to say are not only solid objects, but objects that can move and that can sort of bang into each other. So I'll show you in my scene. I'll just go into solid mode, and I'm going to hide some of the things that we don't need. The vase, the flowers, all the bones. We don't need to see the skull. Okay, and I'll hide the camera. We don't need that either. Okay, so I'll show you what I've got, and then I'm just going to remove it all and put it all back so you can see how I've done it. So if we look a little bit more up close, what I have on my sphere is what's called a rigid body. We're in the physics tab here. If you look at your different menus here, physics is the one with the circle and the little line around it. And so the ball, the things that move, the ball and the gold blocks, they both have a rigid body that is active and dynamic. The table has a rigid body that is passive, which means that it doesn't move, it just sort of affects the movement of other things. And I think I've just put that on one of the books. Yeah, so we've got a passive rigid body on the other book, but I've also put this thing called animated. And that's just because to get my animation working, I did a little trick where if you see here, my book just like tips up a little bit to get the ball rolling. And that's because I wanted a little bit of stillness at the beginning of my animation. And you can't really see it in the final animation. It's really subtle. If I go back to the camera and I look through the camera, I can press view, cameras, set object as camera. If I press play again, you know, it's a really small movement that you can only just see it because it's something that's sort of facing the camera. A few other little tricks I did. I'll just hide the camera again. I think in order to get the ball to roll properly, I probably what would I have done? I think I turned its let me just find where I'm looking. I turned its friction down very low. So that just means friction is one of the forces that would slow down its movement. If you think about like whether a surface is very slippery or very rough, we're altering the friction. And so I've turned the friction down very low so that the ball rolls. If I make the friction much higher, if I turn that to 1 and then play it, it might not even roll. Oh, it does, but much more slowly. So actually it looks like I can get this to work with the friction higher. Still works just fine. Okay. All right. Now, because we're using a combination here of a keyframed animation that's here, which is a more common basic animation technique, and then physics animation. Physics animation is much more complex sort of under the hood, like for what Blender is doing. And that means it's much more sort of likely that we can get, you know, various bugs in the system. So I'll try to keep this nice and simple, but as you start making your physics animations, you know, I wouldn't be surprised if things get a little bit complicated, some things might not work, and we might look at what's better in some cases to do a physics animation or a regular keyframed animation. But okay, so let's just go back to something that you probably have. So I'm just going to delete these objects and I'll make them again. So the first one, I'm going to add my 3D cursor here by pressing Shift and right click. And that just means I can add my cube where I want it. So I'll just go Shift A, add a cube. It's probably going to be huge. If we look here, it's like 2 meters by 2 meters. I'm going to make it like 10 centimeters high. I'll grab it up and I'll keep it 10 centimeters high, but I'll make it like, I don't know, 3 centimeters wide and maybe 2 centimeters in width. Okay, and now I will just move it down so that it's sort of resting on the table. I'll apply my scale, Control A, apply scale, and then I'm just going to give the whole thing a bevel on all edges. So in edge select mode, I can just press A, select all the edges, click bevel, and just drag it out a little. And just because I want it to be rounded, kind of like a gold bar, and I'll just raise that up, something like that looks fine. So I've got 3, and if I go out of edit mode, there I've got my gold bar. Now the shader that I made was pretty simple. If I go into shading and look at my bar here, we can make a new one here, and I can call it gold 2. To make a metallic shader, first thing we do is we switch metallic to 1. We can see it's already gone a bit shiny. And if you're not sure what color to have something for gold, you can actually do a little trick and go gold hex code. And a hex code is basically a single code that gives you, the equivalent of RGB values or any other system. So if I go in here, I could just go into the color, select hex, and then just paste that value there, hit enter, and it's giving me that gold color. I'm going to right click and say shade smooth. I'm going to turn the roughness down to maybe 0.1. So now we're getting pretty close. The last thing I'd say, it's probably too saturated. It looks really yellow. So I'll just go into my base color, go to hue saturation value, which is HSV, and I'll put the saturation down to, maybe that's okay for now, 0.7. You can do much more to make a gold shader. You could add some noise texture like we did before, so it's like maybe it just has a tiny bit of metal bumpiness, but this is not a texturing tutorial, so I'm just going to keep this pretty simple. Now, just to demonstrate the physics, I'm going to rotate this on the Z-axis, RZ90, so it's facing the other way. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to add my rigid body. I'll make sure I'm on frame 1. I'm going to add my rigid body here. I won't change anything. I'm just going to now move this sort of gold bar up, GZ, and I'm going to press play and see what happens. We'll see it'll just fall sort of down through everything. Now, the reason that it's not bouncing off the table is that we also need to tell Blender that the table is a solid object. So if I select my table here and I add a rigid body, if I press play now, we'll see both of them are going to fall, which is not what we want. So if we go back to the beginning, we need to have the table as something that doesn't move. It just has to be something that the block can hit. So we'll click here, and instead of active here, we're going to select passive, which means it won't move. So now if I press play, the table's not moving, and my block is landing on the table quite firmly. I wonder if I lower the friction here, will it fall over? 0.1. Let's have a look. No, it still seems to balance. But if I rotate it just a little bit, RY, just a tiny bit, it should be a little bit off balance. And there we go. It falls over. Okay, so what I'll do now, I'll undo that rotation, put that back to 0, and I'll put it back on the table. Nice and close. Something like that. And just check that that's all okay. If I press play, let's have another look. Go back to the beginning. Press play. Yeah, very, very sort of minimal change. That's okay. So then I will just duplicate this a few times. If I look from the top like this, I will duplicate, something like that. And then I will add the ball. So at the moment, if I press play, nothing's going to happen. You know, if I rotated one of these on the y-axis just a tiny bit, we'd have, whoop, y. Oh no, sorry, I need to do that from frame 1 because they've already got their rigid bodies. So if I rotate that a little bit, I'll show you what I did on the y like this, ry just a tiny bit, we should get a cool like domino animation, I think. No, that wasn't enough. Let's go back to the first frame and try it now. It seems to want to go back to its center now. Why is that? Let's just check I haven't baked any settings. No, delete all bakes. Why is that not falling over? It seems to be very happy to stand up. This is where sort of physics animations can get, or maybe it's because it's very heavy. 1 kilo is quite heavy. So if I put this to half a kilo, maybe it'll fall over more. Let's have a look. No, it's got kind of a bounce to it. So this is where I might need to do a little bit more troubleshooting. Take me back to frame 1. Have that rotation quite substantial. It should fall over now. Yeah, okay, so there's probably a bit more tweaking I need to do here in order to get all this right, but I'm going to set these to be lighter because the physics is calculating off all of these different values, and half a kilo is already something quite heavy for that size, but they are meant to be metal. But let's have a look now. Still not quite right. I'll put that a little bit closer. Okay, I might come back to this and re-record this and see if I can sort out some of these things. Now the friction is very low, so see how it's really sliding across the table. We definitely don't want that. So let's go back to this friction and turn the friction back up. I might just put that back up to, let's check what the default value for the friction was. If I remove the rigid body and add a new one, the default value is 0.5, so let's leave it there, and I'll switch these all back to 0.5. And perhaps that, you know, that might have something to do with why it was twitching a lot before. Let's see how that works now. Okay, definitely sliding across the floor less. I'll have to come back and see exactly what was causing that little bounce I had there, which I didn't like so much. Okay, so I'm just going to remove this one because I don't need it at the moment. I'm going to now look at this rolling ball. So if I put my 3D cursor here, shift right click, shift A, and then I'll add a sphere, which is also much too big. So scale 0.01, it's probably a bit too small. I'm also going to hide this environment box. I don't need to see that right now because now I can just look here and let's make this sphere a little bit bigger. And again, this is just a starting point for your animation, right? What you make animated, that's something that I want you to creatively explore. And you're probably going to end up with some problems of things not working. But this is the whole discovery process of how we get better at things, is by experimentation. So, okay, let's look at this ball. Now, what I can do at the moment is if I just, you know, rotate the book like this and shift up my ball, it'll roll down. One thing I just noticed, my book rotated very conveniently on its axis here, whereas your book is probably rotating, if I rotate it on the x-axis, through the middle. So how did I do that? Okay, so if we look at this book, I'll put my origin back to where yours probably is, which is probably in the center of the object here. That little dot is the origin. Sometimes if we make an object like a door or anything that we want to rotate around one end, we have to have the origin be where we want the rotation to happen from. By default, objects will rotate around their center. So what we want to tell Blender is that the center of this book is on the spine. And the way we can do that is if we go into edit mode by pressing tab, I'll select this face here, and then I'll press Shift S and I will say cursor to selected. Shift S, cursor to selected. What that does is it places the 3D cursor in the middle of that face. Now I'll go back into object mode And in the object menu here, I will say set origin, origin to 3D cursor. And see how that little orange dot is no longer in the middle of the book. It's now where the 3D cursor is. And if I rotate the book on the X-axis by pressing R and X, it now rotates on the spine, which will be good for when we animate it in a moment. For now, I'm just going to press R and X and sort of roll it up. And we want to have the ball roll down the book. So if the book is on a slanted surface, the ball will definitely roll down it. So if I move my ball up, now much like the table, I need to add a rigid body to my book. I'll turn off these keyframes because we're going to do this later. You don't have to worry about that. I'll just leave my book rotated like that, and I'll add a rigid body, and I'll set the type to passive, and then I'll add a rigid body to my sphere and leave it as active, and let's leave everything at default and just see how that works. So now if I press play, I'm going to save my file as just, let's call it physics animation. You can keep yours in the same file. I'm just making sure I don't destroy my original. Okay, so now let's hit play and see, does our ball roll down the book? Nope, it doesn't roll down the book at all. So maybe, or is it going to roll down there eventually? No, it's not. So maybe its friction is too low. So let's turn the friction down to 0.1 and see if that fixes it. Now it's sort of, it's actually sliding, not rolling. But in this case, we can actually get away with that because I'm going to do a little trick. I'm going to make its friction even lower. And I'm going to make it look like it's rolling, basically. I'm going to shade it smooth, so it looks super smooth. Oh, and if you see me going back to the beginning of the animation, you can just press this button here, or you can press Shift and then left arrow, and that will just take you to the end. It's just a handy keyboard shortcut. Okay, so now that my friction is set to 0, I'm going to just go into my shading menu, and I'm going to make this a shiny silver color. So I'll just go New Material, Shiny Silver, and I'll just do the same thing I did with the gold bars, but I'll make it silver. So I'll set the metallic to 1, and I'll set the roughness to 0.1, and now we've got a shiny ball. Okay, and now in the previous tutorial, you know, when we added that environment image, that's what's in our render going to give us some kind of nice reflections if I go into my rendered mode on the ball. You know, we can see that I actually use like an outside image. If yours is an indoor still life, it might actually be even more clever to have your HDR image be like the inside of a room. And actually, if we look at a famous painting by Jan van Eyck, Arnolfini portrait, this is a great art historical example of specular reflection. In this painting, there's a reflection in the mirror in the background, and it actually reflects the room that the painting is in. So, you know, technically your HDRI image should also be a room. That would kind of make sense. Okay, all right, back to the tutorial. So now that I've got my ball in the physics properties, I've got its mass, its friction down to 0. I think it should roll pretty well if I press play. And now that it's smooth, it kind of looks like it's rolling. It's actually passing straight through that other book. That's not great. If I go back, you'll see it kind of clipped. This is what's called clipping. Clipping is when you have an animation and all of these things, Blender doesn't treat any of them as solid. You know, Blender sees visual objects, but not necessarily solid objects unless we give them physics properties. So there's a few ways around this. We could put another collider here. That would work. If I put a passive collider here, it will have to bounce off there. We'll see what that looks like. Maybe it'll look good. Who knows? Bounce. That actually looks kind of cool. Or we could move the book back. We could, you know, do a few things. Now, what I want to do is I want it to hit the blocks. So when this hits here, I want to make sure my blocks are sort of in its way. So I'm going to now bring my blocks sort of over here so they get hit. And now if we go back to frame 1, let's see what happens. So now press I'll save my file, press play, rolls down, hits one book, and it takes out a block. That block doesn't take out the others. Okay, so let's just go back again, and I'm going to move these two kind of, I don't know, that way. I'll make them a bit irregular. Let's see what happens now. Bink, bink, bink. Is it going to get the other one? No. Okay. So, you know, maybe this is, you know, there's probably some juggling here to happen. It might be the weight of these blocks. Maybe they're too heavy still. If I make them lighter, like 0.25. I'm kind of guessing here. And I might find some more specific tutorials that really go deeper into physics animations, because I'm sure there's lots of problems you're going to encounter. But I just want to see if we can get this kind of doing what we want. Boom, boom, boom. No, it's not hitting it hard enough. Okay. I could also probably make the ball heavier. No, let's not do that. I can make the friction of these lower. I'm just going to move them closer for now so I don't waste too much time tweaking physics properties. We can play around with that more in class. I just want to get the basic idea here. Boom, boom, boom. Hey, and now they all fall over. Okay. Okay, so that's cool. That's all we need. Now, the last thing I'm going to do in this tutorial is I want this book to sort of tilt, because I want to introduce what is actually a much more important and basic concept, which is keyframe animation. And you might have lots of instances where you just want objects to move in a predefined direction. So let's do this here. So because we're combining here physics, this has you know, this rigid body on it so the ball can hit it. We need to also tell this that it's going to be animated. So in the physics tab of the book, we need to just tick that little box. And then we're just going to do a really basic animation. So in frame 1, I'm going to set the X rotation of this book back to 0. And I will also set the ball so that it's sitting on top of the book. And all I want to do is, let's say in like frame, okay, so I'll keyframe this first actually. So I'm going to keyframe the rotation. So I could right click here and insert keyframes, or I'll just press Ctrl Z. I can hover over here and just press the letter I, which is the shortcut. So at the moment, these are yellow, and if I'm in the animation tab, on the timeline, we've got this yellow dot, which is a keyframe. Now if I go to frame number 10, here, we've moved to frame 10, and I'm going to rotate the book a little bit, just a bit like that, and I put in another keyframe. I'll press I here. If I, what's called scrub between keyframe 1 and keyframe 10, we've made just a very simple keyframe animation. Now this animation can be used to do, you know, this is really the core of animation, is this sort of thing, taking any of these and adding keyframes. But because I sort of wanted to introduce a few different techniques, here we're using just one keyframe animation and then a little bit of physics just for fun. So now let's see if this works. Is it going to lift up the ball and make it roll? If I press play, okay, good. Lifts up the ball and makes it roll. Ball still hits the blocks, blocks fall down. Nice. Now the last thing I want to do is I can actually grab these two keyframes and I can GX10 so the book doesn't move straight away. So now if I press play, there's a little gap. And I can make all of that a little bit further. If I click on the book, I see its keyframes again. I could GX40 and move that much later. And I could also go back to this keyframe here and make this number even smaller, like 1.5. And then I have to reinsert the keyframe so that that 1.5 has been keyframed. If I don't hit insert, it'll just revert back to the keyframe that I set before. So now if we look from the side, there's this little change. So if we go to the beginning of the animation, nothing happens. Now the book goes up and slowly the ball rolls. And the nice thing about this is that, you know, the smaller you make that number, the less noticeable the movement of the book will be. So now if we go back to our camera, and if I'm just going to control numpad 0 to look through the camera, and I'll go to rendered mode, and if I press play, we still see the movement of the book. It's huge. So we could definitely make that smaller. So if I make this number something like, I'll have to be on the keyframe. Remember to do that, Peter. So at the moment that's on frame 60. Let's make that 0.5 and hit enter, and then insert, or I to insert that keyframe. If I go back to the beginning, shift left mouse arrow, press play, book pops up a little bit, and the ball is moving very slowly, which is kind of cool, you know, like it's something like at first we don't notice it. So that's got a nice, I think a nice kind of feeling to it. Yeah, and there go our bars. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. And of course I can bring back in my flowers. Oh, I've got a double vase at the moment. Whoops, have I done this right? Yep, sorry, I want that vase there. And I can bring back in my fossils and my environment and all of that stuff. And also, finally, last thing you should do is these cubes and stuff I made, I would put all of them, I would name them something like gold_bar1, and I'll just copy and paste that. So this is paste gold bar 2 and paste gold bar 3, so we know what they are. And I'm going to shift select these and then control select the sphere, and I'm going to put them all in the gold bars group. So it's also something that I can easily now turn on and off. Okay, so that's it for this tutorial. I'm going to do maybe one or two more. Maybe I'll play around with the flowers, have them move a little bit, and then I'll show you how to export the final animation as a video file. Okay, lovely. I hope you're all progressing well. And just to remind you, of course, I want you to start experimenting yourselves and find some other things to animate. And you can look online for inspiration, or you can just look at your objects and think, well, what would be, you know, some interesting movement to happen to these objects? And, you know, interesting idea plus YouTube, I'm sure you'll find some great stuff. Okay, I'll see you all soon. Bye-bye.